The stars had always promised humanity a future filled with wonder and discovery. But in the year 2847, those same stars became witnesses to an act of cruelty that would change everything forever. Commander Lyra Okonkwo stood at the observation deck of Meridian Station and watched the enemy fleet grow larger against the black void of space. She had known this moment would come eventually, but knowing did not make it any easier to accept. The Vethkai Dominion had sent over 300 warships to take the small medical outpost, and she commanded a garrison of barely 5,000 souls. Most of them nurses and doctors and support staff who had never fired a weapon in combat. The Vethkai were insectoid beings who stood nearly 8 feet tall, with hard shells of dark green chitin and compound eyes that showed no warmth or mercy. They had looked upon humanity with disgust from the very first contact between their species. To them, mammals were weak creatures, soft-bodied things that deserved only contempt and subjugation. The war had been brewing for years, and now it had finally arrived at Lyra's doorstep. "Commander, we cannot hold them," her second officer reported, his voice trembling with fear and exhaustion after 3 weeks of constant bombardment. "Our shields are failing, and we have lost contact with the outer defense platforms." Lyra closed her eyes and thought of her daughter Sarah, who served aboard a carrier somewhere in the inner colonies. She thought of her husband, who had passed away 2 years ago. She thought of all the wounded soldiers in the medical bays below who depended on her to make the right choice. The Galactic Compact had rules about prisoners of war, rules that even the Vethkai had signed and agreed to follow. Surrender was not cowardice when it meant saving lives. "Open a channel to the Vethkai flagship," she commanded, her voice steady despite the weight pressing down on her heart. "Tell them we are prepared to discuss terms of surrender." The response came within minutes. The Vethkai High Commander accepted their surrender and promised that all prisoners would be treated according to the laws of the Galactic Compact. Lyra wanted to believe those words, wanted to trust that honor existed even among enemies. She ordered her people to lay down their weapons and prepare for capture. 2,316 human women were taken prisoner that day. They were loaded onto Vethkai transport ships like cargo, stripped of their uniforms and their dignity, herded into holding cells that stank of fear and alien chemicals. Lyra tried to keep her people calm, tried to remind them that rescue would come, that the United Terran Coalition would never abandon them. But rescue did not come. 6 weeks passed in darkness and silence. The prisoners were moved from ship to station to planet, always deeper into Vethkai space, always further from any hope of salvation. The guards mocked them in their clicking, hissing language, called them soft shells and meat creatures, and worse things that had no translation in human tongues. Then came the day when everything changed, the day when hope died and something far darker was born. The prisoners were gathered in a massive arena on the Vethkai world of Vethros Prime. Thousands of alien spectators filled the stands, their compound eyes glittering with anticipation for the entertainment that had been promised. Giant screens floated above the arena, broadcasting the scene to billions of viewers across the Dominion. Commander Lyra Okonkwo was dragged to the center of the arena floor, her wrists bound, her body covered in bruises from weeks of mistreatment. A Vethkai official announced to the cheering crowd that today they would witness the true weakness of mammalian species. Today they would see proof that humans were nothing more than animals fit only for slaughter. What followed cannot be described in full, for some horrors are too great for words to contain. The Vethkai did not simply execute their prisoners. They turned murder into spectacle, cruelty into celebration, and the deaths of 2,316 women into a show for their citizens to enjoy. The cameras captured everything, every scream, every plea for mercy that went unanswered, every moment of suffering that the crowds greeted with clicking applause. It lasted for hours. Commander Lyra Okonkwo was among the last to die. She faced her executioners with her head held high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Her final words were simple: "My people will remember." The Vethkai laughed at this, for what could soft mammals possibly do against the might of the Dominion? Far across the stars, the United Terran Coalition waited for news from their captured personnel. Diplomatic channels had gone silent, and every attempt to negotiate for prisoner releases had been met with excuses and delays. Admiral Marcus Chun, commander of the Third Fleet, had a terrible feeling growing in his gut, the kind of feeling that only comes when something has gone very wrong. Then a data packet arrived at Fleet Command, transmitted from an anonymous source within Vethkai space. It contained 23 hours of footage, and the file was marked with a simple label: Meridian Station Personnel, Final Disposition, Admiral. Chen watched the footage alone in his quarters. He was a veteran of 3 wars, a man who had seen death and destruction on scales that would break most minds, but nothing had prepared him for this. He watched for 6 hours before he could watch no more. His hands shook, his vision blurred with tears he had not shed in decades. When he emerged from his quarters, his aide immediately noticed that something had changed in the Admiral. The warmth had left his eyes, replaced by something cold and hard and utterly without mercy. "Sir, are you all right?" the aide asked. Admiral Chun did not answer the question. Instead, he spoke 5 words that would echo through history: "Get me the War Council." Within hours, the footage began to leak. Someone, perhaps many someones, made sure that humanity would see what had been done to their daughters and sisters and mothers. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Earth fell silent for 1 full day, a silence of shock and grief and disbelief. And then Earth began to roar, and the roar spread across every human colony, every station, every ship sailing between the stars. It was a roar of rage and sorrow and terrible, terrible promise. The Vethkai had wanted to prove that humans were weak. They had made the worst mistake in the history of their species. The news spread across human space like fire through dry grass, jumping from world to world, station to station, ship to ship, until there was not a single human being who had not heard what the Vethkai had done. On Earth, people gathered in the streets of every major city, standing in silence as the footage played on massive public screens. Mothers held their children close, fathers wept openly without shame, and young people stared with eyes that hardened minute by minute. The silence lasted for 1 full day, a day when factories stopped, when schools closed, when the entire machinery of human civilization simply paused to absorb the weight of what had happened. Then came the anger. On Luna, workers walked off factory floors and marched directly to military recruitment centers. Lines stretched for miles as men and women of every age demanded the chance to serve. Shipyards that had been operating at 60% capacity suddenly found themselves overwhelmed with volunteers, who worked double and triple shifts without complaint. The production of warships increased tenfold within a single week. On Mars, the colonial parliament descended into chaos as representatives screamed at each other across the chamber floor. Some called for immediate retaliation. Others warned against acting rashly, but the voices of caution were quickly drowned out. The parliament passed a resolution declaring total war against the Vethkai Dominion by a vote of 847 to 3. And those 3 dissenting voices found themselves removed from office by their own constituents within days. Colony worlds that had remained neutral in the conflict now declared their allegiance to Earth. Titan sent its famous ice mining fleet to be converted into military transports. Europa offered its submarine shipyards for warship production. Even the distant settlements of the Outer Reach, who had always valued their independence above all else, sent messages pledging their full support. But humanity did not stand alone. The Rithani Collective, a species of sleek blue-skinned beings known for their mastery of stealth technology, sent an ambassador to Earth within 3 days of the massacre becoming public. The ambassador carried a simple message. We have seen what the Vethkai have done, and we cannot allow such evil to go unpunished. Tell us what you need, and we will provide it. The Amani Federation, longtime rivals of the Vethkai, offered their intelligence networks and communication codes. They had been monitoring Vethkai military channels for centuries and possessed knowledge that would prove invaluable in the coming conflict. Their chancellor appeared on human broadcasts to declare, "Today, we are not merely allies of convenience. Today, we stand with humanity as brothers and sisters against a common darkness." Most surprising of all was the response from the Duan, a mysterious species who had maintained strict isolation from galactic affairs for over 1,000 years. They communicated through mathematical equations rather than words, and their technology was so advanced that other species could barely comprehend it. A Duan vessel appeared at the edge of the Sol system and transmitted a single message. "We offer the gift of collapsed gravity. Use it wisely." Admiral Marcus Chun, upon receiving the Duan technology, smiled for the first time since watching the massacre footage. The gift would allow human ships to create temporary gravity wells that could trap enemy fleets in place, turning every battle into a cage from which there was no escape. President Amara Osei addressed the United Terran Coalition from the steps of the Global Assembly building in Geneva. Behind her stood representatives from every human colony world, and beside them stood ambassadors from the Ruthani, the Amani, and a holographic projection of the Duan mathematical entity. Billions of humans watched her speech across hundreds of worlds. "Citizens of the Coalition, allies, and friends," she began, her voice carrying the weight of history. "We did not seek this war. We have always preferred peace, always chosen diplomacy over violence, always believed that understanding could bridge even the widest gaps between species. But the Vethkai have shown us that some gaps cannot be bridged. Some evils cannot be negotiated with. Some acts demand a response that goes beyond mere politics." She paused and looked directly into the cameras. "They massacred our women. They tortured our sisters. They murdered our daughters and broadcast their deaths as entertainment for their people to enjoy. They believed this would break us, would show the galaxy that humanity is weak and easily crushed." Her voice dropped to a cold whisper that somehow carried more power than any shout. They were wrong. The crowd erupted in cheers that lasted for several minutes before the president raised her hand for silence. "I will not promise you a quick war. I will not promise you an easy victory. I will not promise that we will emerge from this conflict unchanged. What I will promise is this. The Vethkai will learn what happens when humanity is pushed beyond the limits of tolerance. They will learn that our kindness is not weakness, that our mercy has limits, and that when those limits are crossed, there is nothing in this galaxy that can save them from our response." Behind closed doors, away from the cameras and the crowds, Admiral Chun presented Operation Crimson Dawn to the War Council. The plan was not merely ambitious. It was unprecedented in scope and ferocity. Chun proposed not a limited military engagement, but a complete dismantling of the Vethkai dominion, a systematic destruction of their military capability, followed by permanent occupation of their territory. Some council members hesitated. The plan seemed too extreme, too absolute, too much like vengeance rather than justice. Admiral Chun responded by playing 30 seconds of the massacre footage. The screams of dying women filled the chamber. The clicking applause of the Vethkai audience echoed off the walls. The face of Commander Lyra Okonkwo appeared on screen in her final moments, bloody but unbowed. When the footage ended, no one spoke for a long moment. Then the council voted unanimously to approve Operation Crimson Dawn. The gears of war began to turn. Across human space, Fleets assembled, armies trained, and weapons were forged in numbers that the galaxy had never seen. The Vethkai, watching from their distant worlds, expected humanity to lash out in blind rage, to make mistakes born of grief and emotion. They did not understand that humanity's greatest weapon was not its anger, but its patience. They did not understand that the silence gathering in human space was not the silence of defeat, but the silence before thunder. 4 months passed without a single human attack. The Vethkai High Command grew confused, then contemptuous. They declared that the mammals had accepted their place in the natural order, that the massacre had proven human weakness once and for all. They could not have been more wrong. When humanity finally moved, it would move with the force of every star in the sky, and the Vethkai would learn a lesson that the galaxy would never forget. The Vethkai Dominion had stood for over 2,000 years, a mighty empire spanning 47 star systems, protected by a fleet of 12,000 warships and defensive stations that had never been breached by any enemy. Their military academies taught that the Dominion was invincible, that their warriors were the finest in the galaxy, that no force could ever threaten their civilization. They were about to discover how wrong they had been. Operation Crimson Dawn began on a day that would later be remembered as the Day of Reckoning. It began not with a single attack, but with 100 attacks happening simultaneously across the entire border region of Vethkai space. Human fleets appeared from seemingly nowhere, emerging from the darkness between stars like ghosts materializing from shadow. The Rithani stealth technology worked perfectly. The Vethkai detection systems, which had guarded their borders for centuries, saw nothing until the human ships were already within weapons range. By the time alarms began to sound, it was already too late. 12 border systems went dark in a single hour. The attacks followed a precise pattern that spoke of months of careful planning. First, the communication relays were destroyed, cutting each system off from the rest of the Dominion. Then the defensive platforms fell, overwhelmed by concentrated fire from ships that outnumbered them 10 to 1. Then the shipyards burned, their half-completed warships exploding in brilliant flashes of light that could be seen from distant worlds. Admiral Chun commanded the main assault fleet from the bridge of the UTS Remembrance, a dreadnought that had been built in secret over the past 4 months and named in honor of the Meridian Station victims. He watched the tactical displays with cold satisfaction as system after system reported victory. Admiral, the Vethkai Third Fleet is attempting to retreat from the Karth system, his tactical officer reported. Shall we pursue? Activate the Duan gravity wells, Chun ordered. No one escapes. No one warns the inner systems. We advance in silence until we are at their throats. The Duan technology proved devastating. Massive gravity wells appeared around the fleeing Vethkai ships, trapping them in place like insects caught in amber. The human fleet closed in and destroyed them methodically, leaving nothing but debris floating in the void. On the ground, human marines landed on Vethkai military bases and outposts with ruthless efficiency. They moved through corridors and bunkers like water flowing through cracks, overwhelming defenders who had never faced an enemy so determined and so well prepared. The Marines had orders to capture or eliminate all military personnel, and they followed those orders without hesitation. Most Vethkai soldiers refused to surrender. Their culture taught that death was preferable to mammalian captivity, and they fought to the last breath. This suited the human Marines perfectly well. They had watched the massacre footage during their training, had memorized the names and faces of the 2,316 women, and they carried those memories into every battle. Commander Desuke Tanaka led the assault on Vethrus Prime, the very world where the massacre had taken place, where the cheering crowds had watched human women die for their entertainment. His grandmother had been a nurse at Meridian Station, one of the 2,316 whose names were now carved into his soul. Tanaka's forces landed under heavy fire, but they did not falter. They pushed through the defenses with a fury that shocked even the Vethkai, who had believed themselves the masters of warfare. Within 12 hours, human soldiers stood in the streets of the capital city, and the Vethkai civilians, who had once cheered for human blood, now cowered in their homes. The Vethkai High Archon, supreme ruler of the Dominion, broadcast a message demanding to know by what right humanity invaded sovereign territory. Commander Tanaka's response was transmitted on every frequency, heard by every Vethkai in the system and recorded for history. By the right of 2,316 women whose names I carry with me, he declared, his voice cold and hard as the void between stars. By the right of Commander Lyra Okonkwo, who died with dignity while your people applauded. By the right of every mother, every daughter, every sister whose blood you spilled for entertainment. Surrender now, or we will teach your children to fear the dark. The High Archon did not surrender. Instead, he ordered a massive counterattack, calling upon reserve fleets from the inner systems to drive back the human invasion. Ships poured toward the border regions. Thousands of warships carrying millions of Vethkai soldiers who believed they would crush the mammalian uprising. They flew directly into a trap. Admiral Chun had anticipated this response. His forces had not merely captured the border systems, but had prepared them as killing grounds. The Dune gravity wells activated once more, and the Vethkai reinforcement fleets found themselves unable to maneuver, unable to retreat, trapped in place while human weapons tore them apart. The Battle of the Korath Nebula lasted 3 days. When it ended, the Vethkai had lost over 4,000 warships, nearly a third of their entire navy, destroyed in a single engagement. The survivors fled back to the inner systems, carrying tales of horror and defeat that spread panic throughout the Dominion. But the humans did not pause to celebrate their victory. They advanced, always advanced, pushing deeper into Vethkai space with mechanical, relentless precision. Each conquered system provided resources for the next assault. Each captured shipyard was put to work building more human warships. Each defeated army added to the momentum that was becoming unstoppable. The galaxy watched in stunned silence. The Amani ambassador sent a private message to her government. I have studied humanity for decades, and I thought I understood them. I was wrong. The species we knew, the diplomats and traders and peaceful explorers, that species seems to have vanished. What remains is something else, something cold, something that does not negotiate or hesitate or show mercy. They are not fighting with anger. If they were angry, we could understand that. They are fighting with purpose, and that purpose is the complete destruction of everything the Vethkai have built. The Rithani commander attached to the human fleet wrote in his personal log, I have served alongside many species in my long career, but I have never seen anything like this. The humans do not boast of their victories. They do not celebrate their kills. They simply move forward, always forward, like a force of nature that cannot be reasoned with. When I look into their eyes, I see no hatred. I see something far worse. I see absolute certainty that what they are doing is necessary and right. The Vethkai Dominion, which had stood for 2,000 years, began to crumble, and humanity had only just begun. The war lasted 9 months, and in those 9 months, the face of the galaxy changed forever. What had been the mighty Vethkai Dominion was systematically dismantled, piece by piece, world by world, until nothing remained of its former glory. Human forces pushed inward toward the core systems with a precision that seemed almost mechanical, and the Vethkai found themselves utterly unable to stop the advance. Supply lines that had sustained the Dominion for centuries were severed. Trade routes that had carried goods between 47 star systems went silent. Factories that had produced weapons for generations fell into human hands and were either repurposed or destroyed. The economic foundations of the Vethkai civilization collapsed like a building whose supports had been removed one by one. Worlds that resisted faced orbital siege until they submitted. Human ships would take position above a planet and simply wait, blocking all traffic, all supplies, all communication with the outside universe. No bombardment was necessary. The humans simply demonstrated that they had all the time in the galaxy, and eventually every world surrendered rather than starve. Worlds that submitted quickly were treated with surprising restraint. Civilian populations were left unmolested, infrastructure remained intact, and human occupation forces maintained order without excessive force. But all military personnel were detained, all weapons were confiscated, and all Vethkai leaders were arrested for interrogation. The Galactic Compact, that great assembly of species that had maintained peace for centuries, called for an immediate ceasefire. They sent diplomats and mediators to negotiate an end to the conflict, warning that humanity's actions were setting a dangerous precedent. The human response was silence. Not rejection, not negotiation, simply silence. The diplomats were received politely, fed well, given comfortable quarters, and then ignored entirely while the war continued. Other species began to grow uneasy. Even humanity's allies, the Rithani and the Amani, started to question the scale of what was happening. They had expected a punitive campaign, a harsh lesson delivered and then concluded. But this seemed like something else entirely. They mean to erase the Vethkai from history, the Rithani commander reported to his government. Not through genocide, I must make that clear. They are not slaughtering civilians, but they are destroying every institution, every tradition, every foundation upon which Vethkai society rests. When they are finished, the Vethkai will still exist as a people, but the Dominion will be nothing but a memory. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Sarah Okonkwo led her company through the ruins of the Vethkai Military Command Center on the planet Vethkora. She was Commander Lyra Okonkwo's daughter, and she had volunteered for this mission specifically because of what her mother had endured. Sarah was not motivated by blind rage. She was motivated by something colder, something more focused. A determination to ensure that every single being responsible for her mother's death would face justice. She had trained for this moment, had studied Vethkai language and culture, had learned to read their computer systems and navigate their archives. In the ruins of the command center, she found what she was looking for: records. Names and ranks of every guard who had worked at the detention facility where the massacre took place. Personnel files with photographs and home addresses. Duty rosters that showed exactly who was present on the day her mother died. Communication logs that revealed which officers had given orders and which had enthusiastically carried them out. But she found something else as well, something that made her blood run cold. Financial records showing that tickets had been sold to the massacre. That wealthy Vethkai citizens had paid enormous sums for the privilege of watching human women die in person. Corporate sponsorship agreements showed that businesses had funded the event in exchange for advertising opportunities. Merchandising records showed that souvenirs had been produced and sold. The massacre had not merely been approved by the government. It had been a commercial enterprise. Sarah transmitted everything to Fleet Command. Within 48 hours, human special forces began hunting. Teams of soldiers spread across Vethkai space, tracking down everyone whose name appeared in the records. Some were high-ranking officials hiding in bunkers. Some were common soldiers who had thought they could disappear into the civilian population. Some were business executives who had believed their wealth would protect them. None escaped. Those who surrendered peacefully were arrested and transported to the newly established Terran War Crimes Tribunal, where they would face judgment for their crimes. Those who resisted were given one chance to reconsider before being eliminated with extreme prejudice. The trials began while the war still raged. Human judges sat alongside representatives from neutral species to ensure fairness, and every proceeding was broadcast across the galaxy for all to witness. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony devastating, and the verdicts were handed down one after another. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Some Vethkai defendants tried to claim they were following orders. The tribunal ruled that following orders was no defense for crimes against sentient beings. Some claimed the humans were not truly people under Vethkai law. The tribunal ruled that ignorance was no excuse for atrocity. Some claimed a massacre was a legitimate act of war. The tribunal showed footage of women begging for mercy while crowds cheered, and asked if that looked like war. The High Arcanizes was captured when human forces finally breached the defenses of the Vethkai homeworld. He was dragged before the tribunal in chains, stripped of his regalia, forced to watch the full 23 hours of massacre footage before his trial began. When asked if he had anything to say in his defense, he spoke words that he believed would rally his people. "I regret nothing. The mammals deserved their fate. Their screams were music to my ears." The tribunal sentenced him to death. The sentence was carried out the same day, broadcast live across the galaxy. The Vethkai people, who had once cheered as human women died, now watched their leaders face justice. They watched the beings they had considered heroes revealed as monsters. They watched their entire worldview collapse around them. Some began to understand the magnitude of what had been done in their name. Shame and horror replaced the pride they had once felt. Monuments to Vethkai military glory were torn down by the very people who had built them. Others remained defiant, clinging to their hatred of humanity, even as everything they knew crumbled. But their voices grew quieter with each passing day, drowned out by the weight of evidence and the undeniable reality of defeat. Lieutenant Sarah Okonkwo stood in the detention facility where her mother had died. The walls still bore stains that she refused to examine too closely, and the floor was marked with scratches where desperate fingernails had clawed at the stone. She knelt and placed her hand on the cold floor. "I found them all, Mother," she whispered. "Every single one. They will never hurt anyone again." Outside, the sounds of occupation continued as human forces established control over yet another world. But in that moment, in that terrible sacred place, there was only silence and the weight of justice finally delivered. The war was nearly over. The reckoning was almost complete. But the scars would last forever. The war ended not with a great final battle, but with a quiet surrender that seemed almost anticlimactic after 9 months of relentless conflict. The last Vethkai military commander, a young officer barely old enough to have earned his rank, transmitted humanity's demanded terms to the remnants of his government. There was no negotiation, no discussion, no attempt to soften the conditions. The terms were simple: complete and unconditional surrender, immediate disarmament of all military forces, acceptance of human occupation authority, and cooperation with ongoing war crimes investigations. The Vethkai accepted every condition without argument. They had no choice. Their fleets were destroyed, their armies scattered, their worlds occupied, and their leaders either dead or awaiting trial. The dominion that had terrorized this region of space for 2,000 years ceased to exist with the stroke of a pen. But humanity's work was not finished. The 47 star systems of the former Dominion were reorganized into protectorates under coalition oversight. Each world received a human administrator who worked alongside local officials to maintain order and begin the long process of reconstruction. The occupation was firm but not cruel. Civilians were treated fairly, essential services were maintained, and genuine efforts were made to rebuild what the war had destroyed. The Vethkai military, however, was completely dismantled. Every warship was melted down for scrap. Every weapon was collected and destroyed. Every soldier was processed through a system designed to identify, those who had committed crimes, and rehabilitate those who had simply followed orders. Military academies that had trained generations of warriors were closed forever. Their buildings converted to schools and hospitals and research centers. The Vethkai warrior culture, once their greatest source of pride, was systematically suppressed through education reform and economic restructuring. Children who would have grown up learning to fight now learn to farm, to build, to create art and music and literature. It was not punishment but transformation, a deliberate effort to ensure that the Vethkai would never again pose a threat to their neighbors. For 100 years, the Vethkai would be forbidden from building warships, from forming armies, from leaving their worlds without human authorization. They would be a watch species, monitored and guided until they proved they could be trusted with freedom. Some called this harsh. Others called it necessary. Everyone agreed it was better than the alternative. At the site where Meridian Station had once orbited, a memorial was constructed unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. A massive structure of black granite and silver steel floated in the void, visible from nearby planets as a dark star that never moved. Upon its surface were carved the names of 2,316 women, each name accompanied by a holographic image that showed the face of someone who had lived and laughed and loved before being taken from the universe too soon. Commander Lyra Okonkwo's name was at the center, surrounded by the names of her nurses and doctors and support staff, arranged in patterns that represented the units they had served in and the friendships they had formed. Walking through the memorial was like walking through a garden of memories, each step bringing a new face and a new story. Delegations from across the galaxy came to pay their respects. They came from species that had been humanity's allies and from species that had never had any contact with humans at all. They came not out of love, but out of a new understanding that had spread through the stars, like ripples from a stone cast into still water. The Rithani ambassador stood before the memorial and spoke words that would be repeated for generations. We thought we knew humanity. We were wrong. They showed us something that we had forgotten, that kindness and mercy are choices, not weaknesses, and that those who mistake them for weakness pay a terrible price. The Amani Chancellor placed flowers at the base of the memorial and wept openly. We helped humanity because we hated the Vethkai, but we stayed because we were afraid. Afraid of what we had helped unleash, and afraid of what might happen if we ever earned such hatred ourselves. Even the Duan, those mysterious beings who communicated only through mathematics, sent a message that scholars would spend decades interpreting. The best translation suggested something like, "The equation is balanced. The variable of cruelty has been isolated and eliminated. May the solution remain stable." Admiral Marcus Chung, now aged and weary after years of commanding the most devastating military campaign in human history, gave the dedication speech at the memorial's completion ceremony. He stood before the gathered crowds, his uniform heavy with medals he had never wanted to earn, his face lined with the weight of decisions no one should ever have to make. Behind him, the names of 2,316 women glowed softly in the eternal darkness of space. "We did not want this war," he began, his voice carrying across the assembled dignitaries and broadcast to billions across the galaxy. "We did not want this victory. We wanted only to live among the stars in peace, to explore and discover and build connections with other species. We believed that all sentient beings shared certain basic values, that cruelty on this scale was a thing of the past, that the galaxy had evolved beyond such barbarism." He paused and looked up at the names carved in stone. "The Vethkai taught us otherwise. They taught us that evil still exists, that monsters still walk among the stars, that peace requires vigilance and strength, as well as hope and goodwill. They taught us this lesson at the cost of 2,316 lives, 2,316 women who deserve to grow old and see their grandchildren and die peacefully in their beds. His voice hardened. So let me be clear, to any who are watching, to any who might consider such acts in the future, to any who look at humanity and see weakness in our preference for peace. The gathered crowd fell absolutely silent. Humanity will always prefer negotiation to conflict. We will always seek understanding before resorting to violence. We will always choose mercy when mercy is possible. But there is a line that must not be crossed, a boundary beyond which forgiveness becomes impossible and restraint becomes complicity in evil. He pointed at the memorial behind him. This is what happens when that line is crossed. Not proportional response, not limited engagement, not carefully calculated retaliation designed to maintain political balance. When that line is crossed, there is only us, and we do not stop until the lesson is learned, until the threat is eliminated, until justice is served so completely that no one will ever dare to test our resolve again. He lowered his hand and spoke his final words. The Vethkai crossed that line. The Vethkai paid the price. The lesson has been learned. May no one ever need to learn it again. The ceremony ended. The crowds dispersed. The memorial remained, floating in the darkness, bearing witness to both tragedy and triumph. Years passed, then decades, then centuries. The Vethkai slowly rebuilt their civilization, becoming farmers and artists and scholars, their warrior past fading into history books that children studied with disbelief. Humanity continued to expand across the stars, still preferring peace, still choosing diplomacy, still hoping for the best in every new species they encountered. But everyone remembered what had happened when humanity was pushed too far. Everyone remembered the 9 months of relentless destruction. Everyone remembered the cold purpose in human eyes as they dismantled an empire that had stood for 2,000 years. Other species sometimes made threats against human interests. Pirates occasionally raided human shipping. Minor conflicts erupted and were resolved through negotiation. But no one ever crossed the line again. No one ever tested the limits of human mercy in the way the Vethkai had tested them, because everyone knew what waited on the other side of that line. The memorial at Meridian Station continued to glow in the darkness, a reminder of both human compassion and human capability, of the mercy humanity offered and the justice humanity delivered when mercy was refused. And somewhere among the stars, the spirits of 2,316 women rested peacefully, knowing that they had not been forgotten, knowing that their names would be remembered forever, knowing that their deaths had changed the galaxy in ways that would echo through eternity. The lesson had been learned. May it never need to be taught again.